At night, the entire world changes. The world lights up and comes alive in a completely different way. At night, we get to relax, we get to enjoy our lives, and we can still enjoy our photography. Photographing at night and in lower light situations is tricky at the best of times, but can make for some of our most rewarding photographs when you know how to do it correctly, so that we can preserve those moments that happen after dark for the rest of our lives. Being able to photograph at night or in lower light situations means that you're never going to miss those photographs that you were not able to take before. Our phones are capable of performing extremely well in lower light situations. We just have to learn how to use them correctly, and this is going to lead to taking photographs that you only ever dreamt of taking before. So lesson number 7, low light and nighttime photography. So we're going to have a look at how you can get great photographs after dark. And photographing at night can be tricky at the best of times, but it can also lead to some of our best photographs. So we're going to learn how to do some really incredible shots throughout this lesson. First of all, though, before we do any of that, we need to understand ISO. ISO I have mentioned multiple times throughout this course, but really it only comes into play, I suppose, now in a major way in this lesson. So we're going to have a look at exactly what ISO is and how we can use it to get photographs in low light and tricky situations, and not just low light situations, how we can use it in our daylight photography as well. So just a couple of common terms to go over as per usual that are going to come up throughout this lesson. Of course, we have ISO. We're going to talk about noise. We'll talk about flash, and we'll talk about ambient light a little bit later on in the lesson as well. We briefly mentioned them in the previous lesson, but there's a lot that we can do with our flashes. Even though they are a little bit limited on our smartphones, there's still quite a bit that we can do with them when we know how to use it correctly. And then later on in the lesson, we'll have a look at how we can use our flashes and movement by changing sync speeds, and we'll talk about long exposures, and that's going to cover a lot of different type of scenarios so that you can get out, you can do photographs like this one here, do light trail types of images, and even more than that. So first of all, I have a question for you. Okay, what does ISO mean? Okay, so we've spoken about it a lot. I haven't really told you exactly what it means. We've talked about what it does, and we're going to have a look at what it does in more detail now. But what does it mean? And I get asked this question all the time, but I'm not going to answer it for you. I want you to answer it for me. And we'll have a look at exactly what the answer is at the end of the lesson. There's a particular reason I am asking you this question, and all will be revealed at the end of the lesson. It is a tricky one for sure, but what does ISO mean? Into ISO and talk about the exposure triangle. So the final part of our exposure triangle is ISO. So we've spoken about light controlled by the aperture. We can't really do much to influence it there because it's a fixed aperture in most phones. Then we have time, which is control our shutter speed, which is a major part of our exposure. We spoke about that in great detail in lesson number 4. But now we have to speak about ISO, the third part of our exposure triangle, which controls the sensitivity, how sensitive our camera sensor is to light. So just a quick review of it. So it controls our camera's sensors sensitivity to light. This means that less light, we can increase the camera's sensitivity for situations where there is less light, or we can decrease it when there is too much light. It's automatically controlled by the camera in most cases, but of course we can change it in our pro or our manual modes. And higher ISO will create noise. Okay, so this is a caveat to using our ISO. It will create noise. Now, ISO is measured in stops. So the same way that we saw with our shutter speeds, that it's measured in stops. Anytime we are increasing the ISO with our standard ISO numbers, we are doubling the amount of light. So from 50 to 100, that's double 100 to 200, that's double. Every time we go up in these standard numbers, now you will see more numbers than this. They're not full stops, they're smaller increments, but these are our full stops. Now every time we double it, that means we're doubling the amount of light, increasing the exposure. Higher ISOs make the sensor more sensitive to light, meaning less light is needed to capture the exposure. To sum it up, so different phones will have different ISO ranges. So you may have a display something like this on your phone. This is actually from a Canon camera, but these kind of displays are more or less universal. So our low range might just appear as low. This is talking about as low as 50 ISO. Then we've kind of got our standard range, which is our 100 up to about 6400 ISO, which would be I suppose our traditional range that we would be using in our photography. Then we have very high extended ones. It might just appear as high 1, high 2, high 3, etc. And this is when we're pushing things really to their maximum, when you're getting into something like 25,600 ISO, which is really, really, really high, will also produce a huge amount of noise. But each one of these is one stop apart. Now, as I mentioned, you may find more numbers in between each of those. These are smaller increments. These are known as thirds of stops, and will just allow you to add a little bit more light if needs be, or reduce the light if needs be, depending on the situation. But when we are using very, very high ISOs, this is when we're going to introduce noise into the image. And I'm sure that you've seen this already. So noise appears like a rough texture over our photographs and is very, very visible at high ISOs. Now, noise isn't something to be too worried about as camera technology and sensor technology really improves. I mean, it's you wouldn't really get an image now that has severe noise at this stage at 3200 ISO. It's a bit of an exaggeration here, but you will begin to see it when you increase your ISO. Now, I mean, how your camera handles ISO will be dependent on the brand, but it will gradually increase as you increase that ISO range. And noise is actually present in all of our photographs. It just becomes more visible when we're using higher ISOs, and in particularly in darker, shadowy areas of the photograph, it's where we tend to see it the most. Now, noise is not the same as grain. Grain is something that is just on film. We can get apps and things that will recreate grain type of effect, but it is not the same as grain. Noise is a digital artifact, where grain is a physical artifact that is on film due to the light crystals that were used in the emulsion. So it is a bit of a different thing. So don't get the two of them confused. When we're talking about it in a digital sense, it is noise. Now, you can test the noise on your cameras. Okay, it's very, very easy to do a test on it. So first of all, you're going to have to set your focus to manual and simply place your finger over the lens, or you can use a dark piece of tape or anything like that just to pop over the lens and take a photograph at different ISO intervals. Now, the reason you need to set it to manual focus is so that the exposure will fire, because if you have it on autofocus, it's going to try to find something to focus on and it simply won't be able to take the photograph. But here, this way, you can see what level of noise you are comfortable with. Okay, so you know when to kind of avoid it if you don't want to introduce too much noise into the image, or when you're beginning to reach the limit. So you can see here in this example, you could quite comfortably go up to 3200 ISO. I mean, it is a little bit noisy, but that's a manageable amount of noise. I mean, but even something like 1600 ISO, which is great for doing kind of street photography, that's very, very good, in this particular instance. As you can see, when we push it to the extreme, all the way up to the 12,800, it's extremely noisy. And what you can see here is called color noise. And as you can see all the kind of reds, the greens and the blues, and this is actually what our sensor is made up of: red, green and blue, and it combines these to get all the different colors, because these are the primary colors of light, and you're really beginning to see that appear when the ISO is pushed up to the limit here. So it's very easy to test to see what level of noise you are comfortable with and how well your own camera handles noise. Now, noise can be managed as well. So there's a couple of options when it comes to noise reduction. Some phones will have the option to apply noise reduction in the camera itself. But a better option is to reduce noise via post editing, because if too much noise reduction is applied, the image will become soft and appear maybe a little bit too smooth. Like you can kind of see in this photograph here, got high levels of noise here over on the left hand side, but it's been managed, it's been improved, not fully removed within the photograph, but it has been improved on the right hand side. And this is a close crop in on the image as well, so I mean it is quite zoomed in on the photograph, so the full image, the noise wouldn't be as visible as apparent. But we will have a look at how to do that, where to apply noise reduction in the next lesson when we talk about editing our photographs. But ISO isn't just about doing low light photography. ISO is very, very useful for lots and lots of different situations, not just those images that we're trying to capture at night. ISO is great for landscape photography, so we had a look at doing landscape exposures back in lesson number 5, and if we use very low ISOs, so for example if we're using an ISO of 50, it will really help to give us those longer exposures, but it'll also reduce the amount of visible noise in the scene as well to its lowest, to the point where you probably won't even see the noise at all. Now, with this type of photograph, of course, you're going to need a tripod for this type of shot as well. And low ISOs are also very, very good for studio photography. So if you're using studio lights, or if you're using any kind of artificial light, where you've got the ability to turn up on the light and to add more light into the scene, you can keep your ISO very, very low. And again, studio photographers would typically shoot around 50 to 100 to maximum maybe of 200 ISO, depending on the type of photograph that they're after, because again, it'll just help to reduce the visible amount of noise in the scene. So very low ISOs, what we would call a slow ISO when photographing in studio. Now, using higher ISOs, we'd be looking at doing things like wildlife photography, because it'll help us to maintain faster shutter speeds. It's also very important to maintain faster shutter speeds when we are using telephoto attachments, and of course it'll help to capture fast moving animals and birds. So wildlife photographers would typically shoot at a higher ISO range to help to avoid using camera or getting camera shake when using longer lenses, but also so that they can keep those shutter speeds very, very fast to capture any kind of fast moving action. And again, you know, there's some amount of anticipation that's going to be needed on your behalf before a bird begins to take off or anything like that, but you're giving yourself a better chance by shooting with a higher ISO and a faster shutter speed. Similarly then with sports as well. It's the exact same thing really with sports photography and sports photographers, is that if you should be using higher ISOs to help maintain and keep those fast shutter speeds and to avoid getting any camera shake. So these are all situations where we're photographing in daylight situations or very bright conditions, where ISO can be changed to be higher or lower depending on the type of photograph that you're trying to capture. So it's not just exclusive for nighttime photography. Now, so moving away from our ISOs for the moment, let's have a look and revisit our camera flash. So we spoke about it very, very briefly in our previous lesson, our portrait photography lesson, but there's a lot more than we can do with our flashes. I've mentioned that they are quite limited, but it doesn't mean that we can't still get quite creative with them. So first of all, flash has basically 3 options. You can always have it on, you can have it in auto, where the camera will decide whether or not needs to flash, or you can just switch it off altogether. Then the camera determines the flash power based on the subject that you focused on, the distance they are away from the flash, and the available light. So you know, if you've got a subject that's very, very far away from the camera, the flash will up the power, but it may still not have quite an impact, because remember, the size of the flash itself is a factor too. Flashes on phones are small, so the spread of light is very limited. A larger flash will produce a larger spread of light, which is why we buy, external flashes for our cameras, because they have a larger flash head on them, which means that the light's going to go further. The flashes on our phones are very small, so they only have a limited range and a limited spread. Shutter speed has no effect on flash, so you can change the shutter speed if you use a faster shutter speed or a slower shutter speed. It won't affect the flash power. And this is going to be important, as we're going to see now in a second. But you can't influence the flash power by changing your shutter speed. It only controls the ambient light. It has no effect on flash. And it is possible to buy attachments to help boost your flash, just like anything, like attachments for your lenses, etc. You can actually buy flash attachments as well. So if you're thinking about doing a little bit of product photography, beauty photography, you may want to look at investing in one of them. It's something we'll be speaking about in module number 2. So with flash, the further the subject is away from the flash, the light source, the less light that's going to fall on them. This is known as the inverse square law, so I won't go into too much detail about this, but to simplify it, the subject who is closer to the camera is going to have more light on them than the subject who is further away. So the light is going to fall off quite dramatically as the subject moves further away. So this is why, and it always makes me laugh, when you see people in, say, football stadiums who are trying to take photographs of the players on the pitch, and you see all the flashes going off. The flash is never going to reach them. The flash is going to go nowhere near them. They only end up illuminating the back of someone's head who's sitting in front of them. It just won't happen. So, the closer the subject is, the better results you are going to have using your flash. Now, one of the issues though, however, sometimes if your subject's too close to the camera, the flash will overexpose them. So you need to be careful of that as well. But in general, our phones will do a good job at determining the amount of light that is needed. Now, when we're using our flash, again, there's two ways to think about using it. So we saw this back in lesson 6 as well. We have our key lighting and we have our fill lighting. So our key lighting is when we highlight the subject. Our fill lighting is when both the subject and the background have balanced and even lighting. And this is something that we can achieve with our flash. So to achieve key lighting, the way to do this is simply, in most instances, the flash will act as a key light, illuminating the subject we are focused on. So generally, when we're in a dark situation, if we simply focus on the person and we have the flash switched on, it's going to act in a key light capacity. If we want to do it manually, we use the flash with a fast shutter speed, because that will keep the background dark. Shutter speed controls the ambient light, so using a fast shutter speed will mean that that background light is going to stay dark, and that our flash will then illuminate our subject, creating this key light effect. Now we can use our flash as a fill light as well. This is known as fill flash or fill in flash, and this is when we use a slower shutter speed. So a slower shutter speed means that the background light, the ambient light, is going to be captured, and we can balance it out then by using the flash as a fill in flash to highlight the subject, and this will create a balance between the natural light and the artificial light as well. So this is known as fill in flash, and it basically just gives you two new options when you're using your flash. You can use your flash as a key light by using a slower shutter speed, and you can use your flash as a fill light by using a I've gotten that the wrong way around. You can use your flash as a fill light by using a slower shutter speed, and you can use your flash as a key light by using a faster shutter speed. And it just gives you two new creative options when you're using your flash. But there's still a little bit more that we can do with it. And when we're using very high speed shutter speed, so if we go very, very extreme with it, we get what's known as high speed synchronization, and this is actually where phones have an advantage over cameras. Cameras are limited when it comes to flash sync speed because they have a focal plane shutter, where, as we've mentioned before, phones don't. They have that leaf shutter symbol, which means that you can actually synchronize a flash at any speed. Now, that's all a little bit more complicated, but basically what this means is that I could use a very, very fast shutter speed, like 8,000th of a second, and still use my flash with it and be able to capture images like this, because flash also has a freezing effect on the image as well. So by using a very fast shutter speed, we're going to freeze the motion as is, but flash will also then help us as well to freeze that motion even more. And you'll also get these kind of dramatic looking photographs where the background's really dark because we've used a really fast shutter speed, and the flash is brightening and illuminating the subject. So this is known as high speed synchronization. We've also got, of course, got slow speed as well. If we use slower shutter speeds with movement, the flash will freeze our subject. So like in this photograph here, the flash has frozen the couple dancing, but the movement has been caught in the background by using a slower shutter speed. So we can also do this with our flashes as well, where if you use a slower shutter speed as well as kind of balancing out that ambient light, we can add a little bit of movement into it as well, and the flash will freeze our subject. Now what you can also try as well, this one's a lot of fun, is simply flash and zoom. So when you're using a slightly slower shutter speed, when you take the photograph, zoom in as you're taking it. So whether you just physically zoom in or whether you zoom in using the actual phone itself, you get this effect, as you can kind of see here, like we're moving in towards the subject or moving away from the subject, and it gives a real kind of sense of action happening in the photograph. It's a lot of fun to try out too. So there's more to your flash than simply just adding a little bit of light to your scene. You can get very, very creative with it as well. So why don't you give that a try out different shutter speeds with your flash and see what different effects that you can get with it. Now let's have a quick look at what's coming up in our next lesson, our final lesson of this module. We're going to be talking all about apps and editing. So we're going to have a look at some of the best photo apps that you can use to help with your photography, manual photo apps that you can use. We'll have a look at editing apps, ones you can use for doing nighttime photography, and just so much more for you to get creative with. So plenty to look at. Back to our lesson, our final topic, we're going to have a look at doing different types of long exposures. So just a few things just to be aware of to get prepared for doing long exposures. Of course, we're going to need to be using slow shutter speeds. So we're going to be going into our pro mode, and we're going to be having a look at using slower shutter speeds to do long exposures, to capture light trails and to do light painting. A couple of tools you're going to need as well. Of course, you're going to need to have a tripod. If nothing else, you will need to have a tripod. Lens cloth is going to be very, very useful as well when you're doing long exposures. The timer on your camera is also going to be very useful. A delayed timer will help to prevent camera shake even more. You can, if you want, also as well pick up a remote shutter release, as like you can see here in the bottom of the screen as well for your cameras. This will mean that you can take the photograph without touching the camera. It works through Bluetooth, and that means it'll reduce the risk of any type of camera shake when you're using a tripod, because you can still get camera shake if you're pressed shutter button and you're not using a delay timer or you're not using a remote shutter release. You'll end up introducing a little bit of vibration into the image anyway. So you will need some kind of way to set the camera off, whether it's through the delay timer or through the remote release. And you can pick them up online. They're very, very cheap. If you do not have manual option on your phone, it is possible to download an app for it. If you're using an iPhone, Slow Shutter Cam, you can check out. You will have to pay for it. As you can see, it's £199, so it's probably in and around €3, $3. If you're using Android, you're going to have to first download a manual camera compatibility app to see if your phone can actually download it, and then you can download the manual camera. So you've got to take two steps if you're using Android and you don't already have a manual option on your phone. So there is ways around it by going to the slow shutter cam if you are using iPhone, and then if you're using an Android phone, make sure to check the manual camera compatibility app, which is free, but you will have to pay for the actual app then itself, the manual camera app, if you decide that you do want to use it and that it's compatible with your device. So the other thing then just to be aware of, you may find yourself using manual focus a lot more when using doing long exposures at night, particularly if you're photographing the stars. You might find that your camera simply cannot find any type of focus, so do remember to switch it to manual focus as well if you are struggling with your focusing in darker low light situations. Now, so with all of that in mind, let's have a look at how we can start taking some long exposures. Starting off with fireworks, a very popular one that I get asked about a lot, and not so difficult to photograph. We do have two approaches when it comes to photographing fireworks. You can decide to use fast shutter speeds if you want to freeze the movement. So you're going to increase your ISO to about 1600. Now, fireworks do give off a huge amount of light anyway, so you shouldn't really struggle getting those fast shutter speeds, especially if you are using a higher ISO. But if you want to try something a little bit different, you can go with slower shutter speeds, so you can blur the movement of those fireworks like in the photograph here. And to do that, you're going to want to use much slower shutter speeds from about 1 to 5 seconds. Keep your ISO as low as possible. Keep it to about 100 or even lower than that if you can. And a tripod will absolutely be essential in a situation like this. Now, if you're finding 1 to 5 seconds is still too long, that the image is still coming out too bright, even if you were to go with half a second of an exposure, you probably find that that will still give you a little bit of blurred movement within the photograph. But the thing is to experiment, hopefully you've got something coming up soon that you'll be able to enjoy some fireworks, so experiment with it, use fast and slow exposures to see what type of results you get. Next is the moon. Now, it is possible to photograph the moon using your phone. You will of course need to use some type of attachment like a telephoto attachment, but it is possible to photograph the moon. Where it gets tricky photographing the moon is if you're trying to capture the moon and everything else in the night sky. That's not going to be possible, so you will have to make a decision whether you want to capture the moon or you want to capture everything else in the night sky. Simply, it's not going to happen where you can capture both in a single exposure. You can capture two separate exposures and combine the photographs afterwards, but the moon is almost like the sun in the sense it just gives off far too much light than everything around it, so it can be quite difficult to capture. But that said, if you want to photograph the moon, a tripod again is going to be essential. You can pretty much take that as a given for the rest of the photographs that we're going to be talking about. You will need a telephoto lens attachment for detail, so if you want to get that bit closer, you need to get yourself some type of telephoto lens attachment. You can use your digital zoom, but you are going to lose a lot of quality. ISO from about 400, I would keep it up high because you want to keep those fast shutter speeds as well. Even like a shutter speed of about 5 seconds, you might find that there's ending them up going to be a little bit of movement in the moon just from the Earth's rotation, so you want to try and keep that shutter speed as fast as possible. And spot metering is very useful for this as well, so because you're going to be photographing the moon against either a pitch black sky or lots of other light around it, so using a spot meter will mean that you're only taking your light meter reading from the moon itself, which will help you to get a correct exposure. You might consider a wireless remote here as well if you're going to be doing a lot of photographs of the moon. It can be a bit frustrating, putting on the timer every time or waiting for it to fire. So a wireless remote will allow you to take that photograph straight away. So it might be a worthwhile investment. And of course, monitor weather reports. So you want to plan ahead. You don't want to get yourself all set up and then it be a cloudy sky where you can't even see the moon, or you've picked a night where the moon isn't even out at all. So be sure to monitor ahead, plan ahead, avoid clouds, and find out where the moon is going to be, at what particular cycle it's going to be, if you want to have a full moon or if you want to have a waxing or a waning moon. Now, moving away from that then, we have our light trails, and this is one of the most fun things you can do with long exposure photography. So to set yourself up for this, so first of all, I would make a decision about what type of white balance you want to use, because remember we spoke about white balance. You can have kind of a warm or you can have a cool kind of look to the photo. Perhaps you do want to have a neutral one, but think about that as well when you're doing this type of photograph. Or you want to have that warm or you want to have that cool kind of look to the scene. You go with very low ISO, so from about 50, if your phone is able to go as low as that. Of course, you're going to need to use a tripod. A cable or a wireless remote is useful, but not essential. But a timer delay is recommended so that you're not introducing camera shake. And you want to really consider the time and place that you're going to photograph. There's no good in going out to try and photograph light trails when there's no cars around, when there's no movement happening at all. So you want to try and pick a time where things are moving steadily, but there's they're not completely stopped either. So you don't want to go out at say 6 p.m. when everyone's just sitting in their cars, they're stuck in traffic. You may want to go out that little bit later, maybe go out at 7 when things are flowing that little bit more, so that you have more opportunity and you're still giving yourself plenty of time to capture lots of different movement, lots of light trails as well. And also be careful when you're doing this type of photography too. You want to try and photograph from overhangs from a bridge, from a pedestrian footway, something like that. I would also recommend that you bring somebody along with you when you're doing this type of photography. As always, there is safety in numbers. Now, closely related to that then as well, we have our light painting, which is also a lot of fun to do. And you can do this on your own, but it is recommended that you do bring somebody with you to do this as well. So to do light painting, again, you're going to need a tripod, very, very low ISOs. You definitely a wireless remote with a timer for best results. So what I mean by this is that you can set the timer with the wireless remote, so that if you're doing the light painting yourself, you trigger the shutter using the wireless remote. It'll count down, then you'll see it flashing to count down, and you can begin your light painting. So it means that you're not going to have to press the shutter and try to run into the scene to do your light painting. This way you can trigger it from where you're going to paint in, give yourself a couple of seconds to get ready, and then start painting. Use a location with very little light if possible, so you're going to want to try and keep away from areas that are well lit. The less light the better, because it means that you're going to have more time to be able to do your light painting. Bring a torch to help you focus if you are photographing somewhere very, very dark. Bring a torch with you so that you can set your manual focus using a torch, the area that you want to photograph on, and then put yourself in that position to start painting away, and move quickly when painting. When you start, don't stop. Just keep going, keep doing it, and you're not going to get it right the first time, but do bring a buddy and practice. It will take a few attempts, but eventually you will get it, and you'll get those shots that you'll be really, really happy with. Now, if you're really into this type of photography, there's a huge amount of accessories out there when it comes to light painting. You've kind of got these different colors that you can use that are interchangeable, that you can attach different types of shapes to them as well. As you can see here, we've kind of got like brush shapes, almost lightsaber shapes and stuff like that as well, to give you lots of different effects for when you're painting. The one in the lower left here is known as a pixel stick, and pixel sticks create these very kind of geometric, kind of graphic types of shapes, just like this here. So if you want to do something a little bit more complex, perhaps a little bit more artistic, you can go with the pixel sticks, but they're going to cost a fair bit more than if you go with a standard light brush kit. There's a great photographer who does a set of light painting sticks as well, named Jason Page, Page, Jason Page. Check him out and check out some of his gear as well if you're really into doing this type of photography. So that is light painting. Now, moving on then, it is possible to photograph the night sky and to photograph the stars on your phone. Now, to do this, you will obviously need to find somewhere, first of all, that is quite isolated and is well away from any kind of cities and light pollution. You will, of course, need a tripod. You'll definitely need a wireless remote or the timer for this as well. Manual focus is also going to be very, very important here too. You're going to want to monitor weather reports, plan ahead to avoid clouds, and you want to photograph on a night that has no moon. The moon just throws off so much light that it will affect your exposure. So you need to photograph on a night that the moon is not visible. And you also, if you have to photograph on a night that's where the moon is visible, try to photograph facing away from it. But the best results photographing a night when the moon's not visible. You want to go with very high ISOs here, so you're going to be pushing things all the way up to about 3200 ISO plus, so as high as possible. Manual focus may be needed, most likely will be needed in this case, and your exposure should be no longer than 20 seconds. Now, you might not think that that's enough time, but when you're using an ISO as high as this and you're in a situation where there is no other light available except stars, you will capture them. Now, any longer than 20 seconds, you're going to start to see movement in stars. You're going to start to see a little bit of streaks going across the sky, which you want to try and avoid with a shot like this. So 20-second exposure would be my maximum. Try it out with 10 seconds first of all. Just push that ISO as high as you can, and you will definitely need to do a little bit of post editing afterwards for noise reduction, which we'll have a look at. So these types of images, rarely do you ever see them before they've actually been edited. So typically when you capture a photograph like this, it's going to come out quite, it'll probably have a little bit of a tint of light pollution in it anyway, no matter where you are photographing. So there might be some slight oranges in the image. It may appear a little bit flat, so a little bit of editing will be needed afterwards. But once you can see the stars, and if you're lucky enough to capture the Milky Way as well, you've got an exposure then that you will be able to work with. Okay, now we can also do star trails. Now this is definitely a little bit more tricky and will require a little bit more work, but it's possible to do star trails with our smartphones as well. And well, the easiest way to do it is there's an app that you can download for it. There's an app designed specifically for this called the Nightcap app, which again you will have to pay for if you're interested in doing this type of photography, but it's automated in that all you have to do is put your camera on a tripod. You can choose the times, the intervals that you want to photograph at, and it will put everything together for you. Okay, so if you are trying to do it yourself, trying to do it manually, you'll need the wireless remote or timer. Again, monitor weather reports. Very low ISOs in this case, as low as possible, because what you want to do is a long exposure. So as long as an exposure as is possible without overexposing the photograph, and you just keep repeating that. So you're going to put the images together at the end. So with this type of photograph, this is a composite of images. This is not just one photograph. It's images layered together to create this type of photo. So you keep photographing. You don't change your location once you've picked it out. You keep photographing for as long as the exposures as you can, and then you can put those together afterwards. Post-production for noise will be required as well. But this all happens if you want to do it quickly. Just download the Nightcap app, which we'll have a look at in the next lesson, and this will help you out with this too. But obviously you're going to have to spend quite a bit of time in the same location, so make sure you're properly prepared. Bring warm clothes with you, bring some food, maybe bring some tea or coffee with you as well, and bring somebody along with you too. So you can make a night of it, but just make sure you're well prepared. Okay, so low light photography. I do hope that you enjoyed that. At the very start of the lesson, I asked you, what does ISO mean? And if you answered the International Standards of Organization or the International Organization for Standards, you are kind of correct. Not fully correct. It's not. ISO is basically, it's the International Organization of Standards. They come up with these standards across the world for not just camera sensors, but for different things like, push buggies, like for your baby, tires, cars. They have standards, and they use ISO numbers to measure them. The reason for it basically is to make sure that if you buy a camera that has 1600 ISO, that it's the same as another camera that has 1600 ISO, so that it's not going to be different, that it's all the same across the board. So, but the word, it's actually a word, isos, which means to equal. It's a Greek word. So ISO comes from this word, to equal, and if you're to be completely pedantic about it, it should be pronounced ISO. It's a word, ISO, not ISO, not an acronym, but ISO. Okay, now that said, I still say ISO. A lot of people will say it does mean the International Organization of Standards, but that's iOS. So it can be a little bit confusion around it. So what does it mean? Well, it's a Greek word, isos, meaning to equal. Okay, that's the short definition of it. Okay, so a little bit of trivia there for you. Now, let's have a quick look at what's coming up in the next lesson. Lesson number 8, our final lesson of this module. We're going to talk all about apps and editing. So we're going to be having a look at all different types of apps, the best ones out there for our phones. We're also going to have a look at editing. So for the next lesson, if you could download Snapseed before the lesson, so this is a free app that's available from on the Play Store and on the App Store. It's actually made by Google. It's a terrific photo editing app, especially because it's free. As we're going to see, you're able to do some incredible things with it. But we'll have a look at that specifically for editing our photographs, and then we'll have a look at loads of different other apps then as well, ones that I would recommend that you check out to help to improve your photography.
Please subscribe, like and share.